Today I will be speaking on the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. What we see is that on November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln delivered remarks which later became known as the Gettysburg Address at the official dedication ceremony for the National Cemetery of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, on the site of one of the bloodiest and most decisive battles of the American Civil War. This address is considered to be one of the best known speeches in American history. Not even the day's primary speech, Lincoln's carefully crafted address came to be known as one of the greatest and most influential statements of American national purpose. In just 271 words, beginning with the now iconic phrase "fourscore and 7 years ago," referring to the signing of the Declaration of Independence 87 years earlier, Lincoln describes the US as a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and represented the Civil War as the test that would determine whether such a nation, the Union surrendered by the succession crisis, could endure. He extolled the sacrifices of those who died at Gettysburg in defense of those principles, and exhorted his listeners to resolve or to come to a resolution that these deads shall not have died in vain. So what we see is that basically the people around, they were electrified by the speech of Abraham Lincoln. And what we see is that from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, the invading forces of General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army clashed with the Army of the Potomac under its newly appointed leader, General George G. Meade, in Gettysburg, some 35 miles southwest of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Casualties were high on both sides. Out of roughly 170,000 Union and Confederate soldiers, there were 23,000 Union casualties, more than 1/4 of the Army's effective forces, and 28,000 Confederates killed, wounded, or missing in the Battle of Gettysburg. After 3 days of battle, Lee retreated towards Virginia on the night of July 4. It was a crushing defeat for the Confederacy, and a month later the general would offer Confederate President Jefferson Davis his resignation. Davis refused to accept it. So what we see is that this is the backdrop against which the address is delivered. And despite the prominent place of the speech in the history and popular culture of the United States, its exact wording is disputed. We have got 5 known manuscripts of the Gettysburg Address in Lincoln's hand, which differ in a number of details and also differ from contemporary newspaper reprints of the speech. Neither it is clear where stood the platform from which Lincoln delivered the address. Modern scholarship locates the speaker's platform 40 yards or more away from the traditional site in Soldiers' National Cemetery at the Soldiers' National Monument, such that it stood entirely within the private adjacent Evergreen Cemetery. Now I will go to the speech. I will read out the text that is in popular circulation. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that this dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. So, what we see is that in this speech, Abraham Lincoln is talking about how we should never forget the contribution of those dead soldiers for the cause of liberty, and the essential themes and even some of the language of the Gettysburg Address were not new. Lincoln himself, in his July 1861 message to Congress, had referred to the United States as a democracy, a government of the people by the same people. The radical aspect of the speech, however, began with Lincoln's assertion that the Declaration of Independence and not the Constitution was the true expression of the founding fathers' intention for their new nation. At the time, many white slave owners had declared themselves to be true Americans, pointing to the fact that the Constitution did not prohibit slavery. According to Lincoln, the nation formed in 1776 was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In an interpretation that was radical at that time but is now taken for granted, Lincoln's historic address redefined the Civil War as a struggle not just for the Union but also for the principle of human equality. We have gone through the speech. I have read out the speech, and now I would like to sum up the public reaction. On the day following the dedication ceremony, newspapers all over the country reprinted Lincoln's speech, along with Everett's opinion was generally divided along political lines, with Republican journalists praising the speech as a heartfelt classic piece of oratory and Democratic ones deriding it as inadequate and inappropriate for the momentous occasion. But in the years to come, the Gettysburg Address would endure as arguably the most quoted, most memorized piece of oratory in American history. After Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts wrote of the address. I would quote what he had written. That speech, uttered at the field of Gettysburg, and then I move on into the quotation. and now sanctified by the martyrdom of its author, is a monumental act. In the modesty of his nature, he said, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." He was mistaken. The world at once noted what he said and will never cease to remember it. Thank you.